Hello, my name is Braye and this is my video on post-traumatic stress disorder PTSD. I've chosen this disorder because there is a long history of the symptoms associated with PTSD. They appeared as soldiers' heart post-American Civil War and otherwise variously have been known as shell shock, battle fatigue, post-Vietnam syndrome and Gulf War syndrome, etc. I will explain to you the symptoms of the disorder, its possible etiology, the tools used in its assessment, treatment options based on evidence-based psychological practice and measurement of treatment outcomes. Psychological trauma is defined as an emotional response to a terrible event, and given the severity, shock and denial can be typical responses. The symptoms of PTSD are listed in the DSM-5 as diagnostic criteria and are as follows. At least one criterion A stressor of exposure to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence in one of the following ways: directly, as a witness, having friends or family suffer the trauma, or other indirect exposure to the aversive details of the traumatic event, perhaps occurring in a professional capacity. At least one criterion B symptom is required, and those are unwanted memories of the trauma, for example nightmares, flashbacks of spontaneous invasive images, or perhaps some emotional distress or physical reactivity after a triggering reminder. At least one criterion C avoidance symptom of trauma-related thoughts or feelings and or external reminders. At least two criterion D symptoms of negative alterations in cognitions and mood that began or worsened after the trauma. For example, overly negative thoughts and beliefs about oneself and the world, or decreased interest in activities. PTSD sufferers may present with criterion E symptoms of altered arousal and reactivity, for example, irritability and aggression, heightened startle reaction, or hypervigilance, where one's in a state of tense expectation of some danger or threat. Symptoms must have lasted longer than 1 month, they have to have created distress or functional impairment, and they have not been due to any medical, substance use, or health conditions. Two specifications are noted, and they're related to individual coping strategies. There's a dissociative subtype, where sufferers may experience depersonalization, a form of denial the event has happened to them, or derealization, where a more global denial is in operation. And yet others may have a delayed onset of full criteria until after the 6 months have passed, where the individual employs a temporal denial strategy which ultimately decays. The etiology of the disorder is being rigorously researched, and not all of those who experience the trauma progress to developing PTSD. A review of prospective studies identified 6 predictive variables: cognitive abilities, coping and response styles, personality factors, psychopathology, psychophysiological factors, and social and ecological factors. Clearly, that's a rather broad scope of attributes to be evaluated, but when a trauma occurs and some individuals go that way into normal recovery or that way into developing PTSD, there is strong empirical evidence, expanded on in Malta 2012, of precise differences in the neuroendocrine, neurostructural, neurofunctional, and psychopathophysiological correlates of PTSD sufferers versus not. The 3 main regions of interest in the brain are the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. In terms of neurocircuitry, the currently favoured model suggests our amygdala, the centre of emotional processing, remains hyperactive post-trauma, and the prefrontal cortex remains hypo-responsive, therefore failing to regulate the amygdala. Such combination leads to the exaggerated response to what would normally be an emotionally less relevant stimuli. The hyperactive amygdala is believed to inhibit hippocampal function, leading to impaired consolidation of autobiographical context-specific memories of the event. The trauma is disproportionately encoded into the amygdala's version of the event with extreme sensory representations, yet only fragmented and disorganized contextual details are encoded due to suppressed hippocampal activity. Firstly, the primary care PTSD screen for DSM-5 uses only 5 items. It has proven to be psychometrically sound and simply explores if a criterion A, traumatic event, has been experienced in the lifetime, and if so, has its impact affected the individual during the last month. The test is easy to use and takes little time to administer. However, the gold standard in PTSD assessment is the clinician-administered PTSD scale for DSM-5, the CAPS-5. The CAPS-5 explores acute symptoms of PTSD over the last week, current diagnosis of effects over the last month, and chronic diagnosis across the lifetime. CAPS-5 achieves this by exploring symptom onset and duration, subjective distress, impact of symptoms on social and occupational functioning, improvement since the last CAP-5, overall validity of responses, and PTSD severity. It also specifies for the dissociation subtypes of depersonalization and derealization. It takes between 45 minutes and 1 hour to administer, and it's quite thorough. Another measure I would like to mention is the PTSD checklist for DSM-5, or the PCLV. It's a self-report scale of 20 items measuring the 20 DSM symptoms of PTSD. Its applications include screening for PTSD and making a provisional diagnosis and monitoring symptom change across and after treatment. The APA strongly recommends the use of cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, for treating PTSD. CBT is a broad term referring to a number of interventions designed to change the way people think about and make sense of situations and behaviours. With the client's permission, an agreed upon process commences whereby the therapist gently evokes the memory of the trauma through either a narrative and/or emotional reminders, and in dialogue with the client using various appropriate strategies, restructures the narrative of the event with calm, logical, rational and positive perspectives. This approach aims to identify the client's distorted thoughts, such as overgeneralized negative outcomes that overshadow and drown out any positive thoughts and would lead to the client expecting catastrophic outcomes. In neuroanatomical terms, CBT aims to reactivate the amygdala's memory of the event, and in that controlled setting enlists the frontal and prefrontal cortices, which are the parts of the brain that are paying attention to the dialogue between the therapist and the client, to re-coordinate with the amygdala. The session can proceed along a variety of paths depending on what the client describes and the re-evaluated rationale the therapist then suggests. It's believed this process leads to a subduing of the amygdala's activity, allowing a resumption of normal communication to and from the hippocampus, which goes on to encode accurate contextual details of the event, returning to an overall more proportionate representation of the event in all associated areas. CBT can take the form of cognitive processing therapy, CPT, the APA's first suggested strategy, and it's also endorsed by the US Departments of Veterans Affairs, Defence, the International Society of Traumatic Stress Studies, and the UK National Institute for Health and Care Excellence as best practice in PTSD treatment. It begins with psychoeducation regarding PTSD, the associated thoughts and emotions, and making the client more aware of automatic thoughts that maintain PTSD symptoms. The clinician gets the client to write a statement of impact about why the traumatic event occurred and its impact on beliefs about the self, others, and the world. The process then directs at the trauma specifically, and a detailed account of the worst parts of the traumatic experience are read out. The clinician's goal here is to expose the avoiding thoughts and feelings associated with the event. Then, through Socratic questioning, the client is led to identify their own logical inconsistencies such that the clinician can create the beginnings of a self-regulating pattern where the client can go on to challenge their own erroneous beliefs and maladaptive thinking. Now that the client is learning skills to address unhelpful thinking, it's hoped they will develop efficacy and agency around continuing this process outside treatment and apply these strategies to other beliefs to improve overall functioning and quality of life. Main areas the therapist would develop efficacy in are safety, trust, power, control, esteem, and intimacy, as these are potentially affected by PTSD. Cognitive therapy, CT, is also strongly recommended by the APA. It follows the same principles as CPT, however concentrates more specifically on imaginal reliving of the traumatic experience, and whilst doing so embedding new evaluations. CT aims to completely redefine the narrative from before the event until after, identifying idiosyncratic memory points that elicit the strongest responses and focus on cognitive restructuring in those moments. The elaboration of autobiographical memory helps to reintroduce a functional hippocampus-amygdala relationship during this process. Focus is then placed on factors such as rumination, safety seeking, and thought suppression, which are all thought to be involved in maintaining PTSD symptoms. There is also some hope for treatment-resistant PTSD sufferers. An emerging strategy uses pharmacological assistance whilst conducting CBT to essentially remove the overwhelming effects of the amygdala's sensory reaction while the therapy proceeds. As controversial as it sounds, using a therapeutic dose of pharmaceutical grade 3,4 methylene dioxymethamphetamine (MDMA), commonly known as ecstasy, doesn't pose the same risk as illicit use outside the clinical setting. With the emotional reactions controlled for, the CBT process can proceed without that debilitating confound. In terms of treatment outcomes, randomised controlled studies of CBT efficacy have been conducted. A meta-analysis of 26 of these, detailed in Kale and Foer 2007, explored PTSD outcomes assessed using well-validated measures like the CAPS-5 scale. The mean within-group effect size for reduction of PTSD symptoms using CBT was 1.43, indicating nearly 1.5 standard deviations from pre-treatment to post-treatment. Compare this to the mean effect sizes for the control group using treatment as usual and waitlist groups of only 0.59 standard deviations. This clearly indicates that currently CBT in its various forms is best practice in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. I would like to add that as with all therapeutic interventions, success will be largely decided by the quality of the therapeutic relationship. The courage needed to reveal these vulnerabilities and proceed through a tumultuous healing process deserves respect and humbly reciprocated commitment from the therapist.